Hey everyone, Sadia Yunus here. I wanted to give everyone a little piece of magic, and it's something that I use with especially my couples, but families as well. It's called the clarifying question. What happens is that when we are in a conversation, especially an argument, a disagreement with a loved one, it could be a friend, especially a spouse, a family member. We tend to have a lot of assumptions about what the other person means. And it's not that we're to blame, it's not that we're doing anything wrong. It's just that we're humans and we have our own internal filter or our inner thoughts, inner beliefs about ourselves, about other people and the world. We may have, and oftentimes it's very negative. We may have thoughts that people are inherently selfish. We may have a belief about ourselves that we are unlovable, unworthy, that I'm a failure and I'm never going to be able to do anything right. And so all of these negative beliefs about others, about ourselves, and about the world, it really comes into our minds when we're communicating with others. When others are having certain opinions, certain thoughts, explanations about why they did things. And so we're having this conversation with our spouse or somebody who's important to us, and they say something that really gets us to think, wow, they're really being really selfish. Or are they trying to say that I'm not good enough? Or does that mean they don't love me? So we get these thoughts, these assumptions in our minds based on past learning experiences, based on our inner voice, our inner schemas, deep-rooted beliefs about ourselves. And so then we make assumptions about what the other person is saying. And then based on that assumption, I'm assuming that, okay, that person's just selfish. Then my response is going to be negative. My response is going to be based on that assumption. And so that's not fair to me or fair to the other person. So what the clarifying question does is it really requires vulnerability. And that's the first thing that we have to be willing to do, is to be vulnerable. Because as Brene Brown tells us, vulnerability creates connection, right? It creates that opportunity for connection. Is that I'm willing to be vulnerable. I'm willing to let you know what I'm thinking in the moment. I'm willing to say that, hey, I just had a really negative thought about you or about me or about what's going on in this conversation. So it requires that vulnerability. And then it requires asking before assuming, or sometimes even after assuming, because I'm assuming something and therefore I'm asking about it. So an example is, a spouse says, we cook something and the spouse says, oh, don't really, oh, it's really salty or something. And so our inner voice could think, oh my gosh, I'm not a good cook. Or, that they're complaining about all this hard work that I put in. And then our response is something that's negative. Well, who asked you anyways? Or something like that. And so what the clarifying question does is I'm assessing what I'm thinking. I'm listening to myself. So I'm like, oh, I just had the thought that, I'm not a good enough cook, or I don't do things right. And so it requires that vulnerability to say to that person, hey, when you said that, I kind of heard that I'm not a good cook. Is that what you meant? And so that expresses the thought that I have inside of me, but it's also allowing the other person to explain. It's giving room for an explanation before assuming. Because let's face it, we can't read other people's minds. We have no idea what they mean, their intention behind things, or what they're thinking. And we like to think that we can read minds, but we can't. And so when I ask that, the other person has a chance to explain, to say, no, I didn't mean that at all. I'm just expressing my likes and dislikes of the food that I'm eating. Or I'm just speaking out loud and it has nothing to do with you. And so what that does is it allows me then to understand what the other person meant, and it soothes my inner self that, okay, it doesn't mean that I'm a bad cook or I don't know what I'm doing. And it also allows the other person to understand what my thought process is. It allows the other person to understand the negative thoughts that come into my mind. And so the other person is able to adjust, the way that they speak, and they can be, kinder or softer, or they know that I might think the next time that I'm not a good cook. So they might add in, oh, you make amazing food. Like, this is absolutely delicious. But, I don't like a lot of salt. And it's not a big deal for that person to express themselves, but they understand the thought process, with me. So the clarifying question, it's so important. Instead of assuming, or when assumptions come into our minds, that we express what we're thinking, about our assumptions about the other person or about myself. Does that mean you don't love me? Does that mean that you think I'm not good enough? Does that mean that I'm incompetent? So these kinds of things, it really takes that vulnerability, but it will allow room for connection and understanding. And then the other person will be able to connect with us. They'll be able to explain, like, hey, I didn't mean that. And so that vulnerability creates that opportunity for us to understand each other better. And believe me, it has worked miracles with couples. Personally, me, in my marriage, it's created so much understanding and communication and connection. And in so many of the marriages that I see in front of me every day in the office, that we're able to get to a place of understanding through that one magic question of asking instead of assuming. And then our response then is not based on our own negative assumptions, but our response is actually based on what the other person meant. So let's practice the clarifying question with ourselves, with our significant others, with our friends and our family members, so that we can create more connection, more understanding, and build healthier relationships. So I hope that was helpful. Until next time, see you later.